Why do you hate Rogu? It's a question that has popped up on both of my American Dad videos so often I could spend this entire video looking at each and every one and still have some time left over. And just to put the question to rest, I don't hate Rogu. It's just a joke. If I'm being honest, when I wrote that script and put that line in as a bit, I genuinely didn't expect to get the reaction I did. But since it went over so well, I kinda just kept going. That being said, I do find the reactions interesting because Rogu is a really polarizing figure. There are essentially two camps of people for Rogu, those who love him and think he's one of the best additions to the cast of the show in a long time, and those who seemingly hate every single aspect of his existence and prop him up as the sure sign of American Dad's downward spiral. But I'm going to try and explain what I think of Rogu, and more importantly, explain why I think Rogu might be American Dad's greatest satire. So, let's begin, shall we? Hello everyone, and welcome to the Void Theater. As always, I'm your host, Alexander. And like I just said, Rogu is one of, if not the most polarizing figure in American Dad history. His acceptance ranges from almost cult-like devotion to wanting to burn him like he's Frankenstein's monster. And for those of you in that latter category, you're probably thinking that I'm crazy for that title in the thumbnail, but just bear with me because I believe that I can prove that claim in this video with evidence to back it up. And I'll do it by addressing three key things. 1. His first appearance and the response from the characters following that. 2. How other cast members have been treated in relation to the way he was treated when he first debuted, and 3, and most importantly, what type of character he's based on and how he carries on the traditions that they created a long time ago in animation. So we've got a lot of things to cover, and I've prattled on long enough. So without any further ado, let's raise the curtain, put the little freak on stage, and see how he plays out. Alright, so let's start with the character's first appearance in the show, because despite not actually being in a majority of that episode, we can learn a lot from it. So a quick recap for anyone who didn't actually see the episode. The main plot points are that Stan and Roger get into an argument over whether or not Roger's personalities actually matter in the grand scheme of things. Stan says they don't, and Roger argues that without his personas, all of Langley would collapse into chaos. Then the episode continues with Roger going into the hospital and then taking a vacation because of a tumor growing in his head, which later turns out to be Rogu. That's really all you need to know for this, but I'm telling you all of it because it's vitally important for the first half of the first point of the explanation. And that's the base of Roger's powers. Because despite American Dad largely being a comedy sitcom, the show has always held a certain level of canonicity for the events that take place in the show. The Antichrist will eventually seize power, thus setting off the Rapture, Klaus being a professional ski jumper before being put into a goldfish, and the power of the golden poop being able to override anyone's will and make them greedy and selfish. These are things that, despite being tied to one-off jokes, have canon out in American Dad. And at the core of that list is Roger. Because throughout the show's runtime, we've been shown that Roger has a vast array of powers. And despite them also being jokes, the writers put a lot of time into the show to make sure they're consistent. They keep it so consistent that Roger will occasionally make references to how his powers work. There are multiple times where Roger talks about being able to regenerate and come back as good as new if he's put back together in time. Something even the family seems to reference at times, since Stan and Francine have also both stitched him up in multiple episodes. Which brings us to Rogu, because at the core of his character, Rogu is a power of Roger's. And yet despite being on the show for multiple seasons at this point, the show actively treats Rogu's origins as a weird thing that just happened one day. And you can see it in his debut episode. When Roger first brings him home, the consensus of the family seems to be that this is something they were completely unaware of.
I'm sorry, what in the living is that?
Oh, isn't it great? My tumor came to life and now I've got a little homunculus. His name's Rogu.
Rogu.
With some characters asking if that's something he can do, and his response is just, apparently. Which isn't too out of the ordinary. Most of his powers are usually met with that type of response. Roger demonstrates his powers and then the family just accepts that. But it's different with Rogu because this is one of the first times the family seems almost unsettled by a power and surprised that he can do something like this. Which doesn't even address the other side of the response since Rogu's appearance. And it's something you may notice in the way they talk around him, primarily in the characters' tones when they talk about him. Because if you listen closely, you might notice some weird inflections they have. Notice in those earlier episodes, nearly all the Smiths, but mainly Haley and Klaus, take this weird, almost forced tone of voice when talking about Rogu.
Not even that infernal Rogu, the king of pranks?
Which actually brings us to the second point of the video, which is how Rogu is treated compared to other characters. Now, sitcoms have no issue introducing new characters as the show goes on. It's the standard formula and it helps to keep the show fresh in the later seasons. King of the Hill brought in the Khans and Lucky, Family Guy has Peter's ever-changing bosses at his job, and American Dad has had Debbie, Jeff, Rogu, and plenty of others. But the key difference between Rogu and not just American Dad, but any of the other shows with new cast members I just mentioned, is that Rogu was almost immediately assimilated into the group as soon as he appeared on the show. Because when you compare Rogu to say someone like Jeff or even Lucky, you start to notice the difference. With the case of Lucky, he was introduced in bit parts in certain episodes and then moved up to full parts as the show progressed. The same thing also applies to Jeff, small non-significant parts at first, then they establish him with a greater overarching story. In fact, this similar structure follows almost every side character, except of course when it comes to Rogu. There was no overarching story, there was no simple introduction, and there was no gradual weaving into the story. And while the argument could be made that he was technically already a family member since he's essentially Roger's child, but I don't think that's what they were intending for it to be. And that still doesn't address the other odd instances with his presence in the show, like the fact that just after his debut, he was getting entire episodes with plots dedicated almost exclusively to him. And the weird thing is that again, this was happening almost instantly, which makes even less sense when you consider the fact that by all intents, it seems like Rogu was meant to be a minor character. A lot of what he does falls into the idea of a side character. He has no real overarching story or events like Jeff, his appearances are sporadic at best, and he really just seems to leech off of other characters like Roger. And again, I get that it's pretty much supposed to be the joke, and to the show's point, it's something they repeatedly call out. Klaus himself specifically mentions it in his episode with Rogu, so it seems like that's the point, right? But, and here's where I'm going to ask for that trust again, because what I'm about to explain is going to sound crazy, but before I do that, we have to cover a very important lesson in satire. Now, satire is a weird form of comedy because it can often go over people's heads, which depending on who you're asking is either the point or not the point. But most people can agree that for satire to be effective, the audience can't be aware of the fact that it's satire. It's why a show like The Colbert Report is often used as a prime example of satire. For years, he was able to convince a decent chunk of his viewer base that he was on their side. Now, I bring all that up because people often confuse satire and parody as one and the same when they're not. See, parody is normally meant to poke fun at something in a friendly manner, while satire is meant to slyly insult what it's talking about. Now at this point you're probably wondering what I'm talking about and how it relates to Rogu. Well, just hold on, because we have to go back to what I said in the beginning of the video where I said that Rogu was American Dad's greatest satire. And for all the people who hate Rogu, congratulations, you were right to hate him, because the show wanted you to. So go ahead and give yourself a round of applause. Okay, don't jerk yourself off, I still have like 10 minutes left and we have a lot to cover. See, Rogu isn't just general satire. He's satire of a very old concept in early cartoons, and that's the concept of mascot characters. Now, for anyone who is potentially unaware of what mascot characters are, well, they should be, because the concept was retired fairly early in animation and for good reasons. Mascot characters were widely considered to be annoying, aggravating, and offered little to nothing to the series as a whole. In fact, you probably remember or have heard of some of the more famous ones because the networks that hold the rights to them will routinely make jokes about them. Characters like Scrappy-Doo have survived in animation history because they were so widely hated, while other characters like the Great Gazoo from the Flintstones were hated to the point of never being mentioned after their short run on the series. And then you have the rare instances where the creators themselves hate the concept of adding in characters like this so much that they actually create entire theme songs just to make it clear that the idea is trash, like in the case of Pinky and the Brain.
And so will Larry.
They're Pinky and the Brain.
And Larry, and Larry, and Larry, and Larry, and Larry, 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 Larry.
Narf!
Larry says narf too.
The point is that mascot characters were widely considered to be the turning point of a lot of cartoons back in the day. Which brings us back to Rogu. And at this point I've probably made a few of you angry with what I'm implying here, but just to clarify, I'm saying that Rogu is satirizing the concept of these characters, not that he falls into the same category as them. And to prove it, let's look at the 3 most common traits of mascot characters. Because when you lay them out, Rogu tends to follow the formula very closely. See, 3 of the most defining characteristics of these type of characters are the fact that they first, traditionally have no real backstory on how they came into the show outside of random circumstance or some relation to a character already established on the show. Second, they often have weird abilities or powers that just barely make sense in the context of the show. And third, and most importantly, they're usually designed to be in some way cute, funny, or just overall kid-friendly. And we can start there, because when you look at Rogu, he does have a design that most have said feel like they were trying to create a mascot for the show. And look, I know when it comes to the concepts of designs, I don't really have a leg to stand on. I look like what would happen if John Oliver gave up and started a very mediocre YouTube career. But Rogu is a genuinely weird case here. Take 2 of the most famous versions of these types of characters, Scrappy-Doo and the Great Gazoo. Now take a real hard look at their designs. They have giant heads, tiny bodies, and speak in a very weird tone of voice. For Scrappy, he had a very high-pitched tone of voice that was made to appeal to kids. And for the Great Gazoo, he was essentially a walking cereal mascot with magic powers. Now take everything I just said about their designs, and then look at Rogu, and you start to see the similarities just distorted. See, whereas Scrappy and Gazoo were aiming for a more appeal to kids cute, Rogu takes the form of so ugly he's cute, but the trademark symbols are still there. He still has a tiny frame and a big head and eyes, but they're disproportionate. His head sags, his eyes aren't equal size, and his voice, or at least the fake one he uses, is slow and slurred. His design is literally what someone with a hate boner for these types of characters would design. Something that's supposed to be cute but is meant to satirize them and ends up looking like a monster. And when it comes to that second quality of weird powers and abilities, Rogu seemingly follows that rule. Cause while yes, Roger's species does have powers, Rogu seemed to operate on an entirely different set of rules. He's able to grow to giant sizes, make perfect clones of himself, and turn into a demonic monster. All things that Roger himself can't do in the same capacity. But it's that first rule that really sticks out. That being the point of mascot characters normally appearing out of nowhere or just being vaguely related to a character in some way, shape, or form. Again, for the Great Gazoo, he appeared out of nowhere, and while he's not directly related to anyone on the Flintstones, you can make the argument that he uses Fred as a connection to the family. And Scrappy obviously is related to Scooby through some unforeseen brother or sister. And Rogu is a mix of both those aspects. He randomly appeared out of nowhere, and is simultaneously connected to the Smith family through Roger. Now, does that mean that the writers intended for all these things to appear in the show the way they do? Well, I don't know. I'm not a writer on American Dad. But I wouldn't take pride in my work? Hobby? I'm just gonna call it work to make myself feel better about this. But I wouldn't be able to take pride in this if I didn't have a smoking gun. Which is why I do. And of course, it all goes back to Roger. Now, for anyone who hasn't seen it, I did do a video on Roger a short while back, and I'll leave a link in the description. But the general point of the video was to talk about Roger as a character fundamentally changing and ultimately defining American Dad in the later seasons. I explored his personas, his alien origins, and the overall impact that he's had on the show. But there was one thing I forgot to mention about Roger, and it's the fact that he's seemingly able to recognize the fact that he's in a TV show to begin with. Now at this point you'll likely point out that a few characters on American Dad have made jokes about the fact that they're in a show. It's actually one of the show's running gags. But the thing is, Roger doesn't just make jokes on it, he actively seems to realize it. And out of all the times the show has made jokes about American Dad just being TV, Roger's a central part of them in about 60 to 80% of the jokes. When Steve falls out a window and causes technical difficulties, Roger's the one talking to the casting crew. For the 200th vagina joke, it's Roger that makes it. But the biggest thing is Roger and Steve attending the new school, because it's Roger who figures out every step of the spin-off.
Just friends who tickle each other.
And the band! Each of your roommates could play the exact instrument you needed. I mean, Spitz wanted to play the bass. Usually you have to force that on the worst guitarist. Face it, this is a spin-off and you're the star!
How they got into it, the plot lines they were going to follow, and how to avoid them, along with how to get kicked off of the show itself. But how is this a smoking gun for Rogu? Well, remember what I said earlier. Mascot characters tend to come from out of nowhere and are faintly connected to the family. Now take that and add in the rule of good satire being that no one knows it's satire. And Rogu and Roger fit that perfectly. You have a mascot character born from someone who's not only aware of the fact that they're in a TV show, but a character who's aware of that fact and then uses it to his advantage from time to time. And that's what makes Rogu American Dad's greatest satire. He's a joke that feels like you would need to dig 15 layers into the show just to get it, but once you go back and watch all the episodes, you can start to connect the dots and see the bigger picture. Or I'm just a crazy person. Honestly, at this point, I wouldn't even be able to tell the difference. But with that, we come to the current call in this video. This is without a doubt the most in-depth I've ever gone into for a show. I now have a trilogy of American Dad videos, and I'm still not done with the show. Because at some point, I will have to go back and do one for each member of the family. But in the meantime, as always, I'll leave you with some questions. How do you feel about Rogu, honestly? And would you prefer he be removed from the show, or maybe reformatted to fit better in it? Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe for more content. Until next time, once again I've been your host Alexander, and I hope to see you back in my theater.